Defending Materialism is a new book by Kolosova, Cockshott and Michelson. Those of you who have been watching my channel will have seen lectures and videos which cover some of the material of the book, but it covers a lot more than has been in the lectures. One of its themes is to improve the reputation of mechanical materialism, which gets a bad rap. It's viewed as being crude, just as being a mechanic was looked down as crude. And to defend itself against this upper-class prejudice, the German Social Democrats, way back in the 19th century, said that their materialism had a new secret ingredient, dialectics, which meant it was no longer crude materialism, but an improved brand. This book is a defence against that aristocratic prejudice. It traces materialism from the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers through people like Newton and Dalton, then Marx and Engels and Darwin, and shows that ideas from classical materialism, from atomism, and from classical mechanics underlie the analysis of Marx. And this is missed by most readers of Marx who don't come from a scientific or engineering background. They come from a background in the humanities, and therefore they don't actually see the mechanical and engineering concepts that are there in Marx. The mechanical worldview centered on the idea of conservation. It was summarized by the great German mathematician Noether when she said that for every conservation law there exists a symmetry. And this can be found right back in the work of Archimedes, where his work on machines, the primitive classes of machines, was all based on symmetries of force in static mechanics. The great advance in the mechanistic worldview came with Newton, because with Newton you get the mechanics of motion and the conservation of momentum. And in the work of his French translator, Aimé du Châtelet, we then get the idea of the conservation of energy. And there is another factor. Newton was against the mechanistic theories of Descartes, which relied on physical contact to produce effects. One of the innovations of Newton was the idea of action at a distance forces. And this gives rise to the idea that the universe as a whole is an interconnected whole, even through the void of space. Now that, if you go and read Stalin, is seen as one of the features of dialectics. But the origins of materialism go much further back than that, and we trace it from the paradox of Parmenides, who said that if nothing comes from nothing, then how can there be any change in the world? Now, Epicurus solved that by saying that we die and decay, but the atoms that made us endure. Change occurs because although the atoms endure, they rearrange themselves. And Epicurus says there are two types of motion, the swerve and the straight. In this, Epicurus prefigured quantum ideas. Now, Marx says he's studying the laws of motion of capitalism. And he started out as an atomist. He didn't start out studying Hegel. He started out studying Epicurus. And In London, he attended lectures on physics at the Royal Institution. So he's deeply embedded in atomism and the then contemporary debates in physics in the 19th century. And his laws of motion of capitalist society are based on conservation laws. Conservation of value in exchange. It's because value is conserved in exchange, surplus value must not arise in exchange but in production. That is his essential deduction. And it's a deduction from conservation laws. It is a mode of argumentation that is Newtonian. And he actually makes explicit reference to Lucretius. Lucretius saying nothing comes from nothing. The other theme, his other great innovation, the distinction between labour and labour power, is also borrowed from 19th century mechanical engineering, from the notions of Watt, who distinguished between energy and power, between work and power. Now, we go through and look at the late 19th century. We know the notion of progress is central to Marxism. But in the late 19th century, there was a lot of debate on the directionality of time. Why does time have a direction, since the laws of physics are time symmetrical? We trace how this was addressed by people like Boltzmann and Thomson, how it was addressed in biology by Darwin, why there is a direction to evolution, and by Marx and Engels as why there is a direction to history. We then look at the big attack on atomism that happened in the late 19th century by German idealism, by Mach in particular, and how atomism was vindicated at the start of the 20th century by Einstein and Lenin. We also look at the history of dialectics and the history of logic. Aristotle distinguished science for establishing facts and dialectics for reasoning, and syllogistic logic was a core component of Aristotelian dialectics. In the 19th century, it could be said that mathematics developed formal logic, in going to Boolean logic, ignoring dialectics. On the other hand, Hegel concentrated on dialectics and deprecated formal logic. Engels, to a large extent, echoed him on this, again deprecating formal logic. In the 20th century, logicians developed the basis for computability theory. They developed the basis for the technology on which the current mode of material production rests, and Turing established the limits to the computation and the basis for computers. At the time, Soviet dialectical materialists in the 30s were denouncing formalism, and Soviet logic research and education ended about that. They knew about computability theory but ignored its implications. This was a serious setback historically for the Soviet Union. The UK and the US developed practical computers during the Second World War, and after the US exploded the atomic bomb, having used computers in the calculations necessary for determining the critical mass of uranium, the Soviet Union abandoned its opposition to logic and built their own computers. People like Markov developed constructive logic as a finitistic basis for computability. And this is one of the key distinctions between a materialist mathematics and an idealist mathematics. The Soviets developed a materialist mathematics based on finite computability. And after that point, dialectical materialism essentially languished as a general theory. But dialectics is reborn in the political strategies of the Chinese Communist Party, in Mao Zedong's On Contradiction. And it ceases to be seen as something to do with the development of ideas. It becomes a practical tool for analysing the class struggle and for formulating political strategies. The book is now available. The hardback version is relatively expensive. If you want to access it, I advise you to try and get a library to order it initially.